So I want to talk, before I get into my 20 principles. This was flip-flopped on the schedule, but I'd really like to talk about this first because we have a lot of new people. I've just been looking around seeing a lot of new faces at this conference, and I'm not sure how many of you really know, like, what an institute is, what an institute does. How many of you follow blogs or podcasts or anything of that nature having to do with Charlotte Mason? Okay, there are a lot of them out there, a lot of different voices out there. So what I want to talk to you about what an institute is and how our role is a bit different from a personal blogger or a personal podcaster. What is it that the Charlotte Mason Institute is interested in doing? Like, what's our job in this Mason milieu? First of all, first thing you need to know is that we're a professional organization. So a professional organization needs to keep things at a very high level of discourse. So you won't find us engaging on those podcasts or blogs, in the comments or whatever. We don't put our 2 cents in on everything. We stay apprised of a lot of things that are going on, but we really have our own projects that we're working on. So that's why you don't see us weighing in on those things. We want to respect the work that other people are doing, and what we really want to do is to work for the common good of the entire Mason community. So wherever people are doing good work with Mason, we want to partner with you. If you have schools, if you have co-ops that are doing something interesting, if you are digging in the archives and you're finding something that you didn't know before, that maybe you've never heard before, you can get in touch with us, and we'll help you dig in that area and find out, because we're still honestly scratching the surface of what's in that archive. So there aren't answers. You're not going to hear a whole lot of answers from us right now, because it would be presumptuous, and it's just too early to settle on this is the way right now, because even just you've heard the Parents Review tossed about. That was a periodical that was sent out. Well, there's 40,000 pages just of Parents Review articles. So nobody has read all of that. Nobody's read all of that. We've only had access to it for a couple of years. So even if you're in the archives and you see an article, you have to keep in mind Mason did allow people that she didn't agree with to write in the Parents Review, and then maybe later she would write something, to share her opinion on that thing. So even if you find an article that you think, yes, this supports what I thought, you still have to look at it in the context of the whole thing. And so there are decades of work left to be done. So that's why you won't often hear CMI saying, this question is settled. We don't think it is. We don't think it is. There's still a lot of work to be done. We're interested in high quality teacher training. And if you are a homeschool parent, I'm counting you in that category. You are a teacher. We do not have an us and them mentality. We are all on this journey together. Whether you're teaching one child or 30 children, whether you have multi-age groups or single age groups, it doesn't matter. Everybody needs the same kind of training. Maybe it looks a little bit different, and we can address those things as they come along, but the principles hold. It doesn't matter where you're teaching. So we are committed to high quality teacher training at conferences like this, in webinars that we have once a month, and then hopefully one day we'll have some kind of certification, some kind of accreditation. Where, wouldn't that be great if you run a private school, if you could go through a database of Charlotte Mason trained teachers? Wouldn't that be fabulous? Yeah, it would. So we're all about that. We would really like to do that. We have a lot of projects going on right now, so that's not in the immediate future, but that's on the horizon. So we're thinking forward. And then we want to support you, whether you are a university student who is doing a dissertation and you want to do something on Mason, or whether you are boots on the ground, in the trenches, teaching every day. We want to support you in whatever way we can. So a few things about what institutes do. Our role as an institute is, one, to preserve Charlotte Mason. Now, we've worked on that in several ways. We helped preserve her original sources and ideas by partnering with Beanie Van Pelt, Redeemer University College, John Thorley, the Armitt Museum, the University of Cumbria. We have feelers out all over the place, making these partnerships, because it's very important to us to preserve those things that, like Carol said, wouldn't exist if John Thorley hadn't put them in boxes, cataloged them, and put them in a vault in the library, at the Armitt Museum and Library. So has anybody here ever used the Charlotte Mason Digital Collection? You've looked on archive and you've seen some original programs, some of those parents review articles, some letters, some nature study notebooks. Those are there because of work that institutes like the Charlotte Mason Institute did. So when we partnered with these organizations, we went over there first to prioritize, because there's so much there. What are the things that people need access to immediately? It's like we had to say, okay, this will be round one, this will be round two. If we get to it, this will be round three. So there are still things that are in Ambleside that are not in the digital collection. We would like to remedy that because we're all about preservation. It's so unpredictable what universities, they get a new president, they say, who is this Charlotte Mason lady? Let's dump all her stuff. Or, maybe the Armitt runs out of money and they have to close their doors and now we don't have access anymore. So that's important to us to get all of that digitized so that it's out there for people. And a lot of people, there have been a lot of groups that have come up since the digital collection was made public. They're basing their work now on work that the Institute did several years ago. So we want to make those primary sources available to you guys and to organizations, and whatever your field of research, we'd like to know about it. We do study those documents, and we do have to make some interpretations. Anytime you read anything, you interpret it through your lens. So we're looking at the lens of our own time, our own place, and sometimes we have to think about, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense if you live in 1920 in the Lake District of England. It makes less sense if you live in 2019 in America or in Canada or in Australia or wherever. So we have to wrestle with some questions sometimes. Another role of an institute is to gather together people who understand research and to stay abreast of what's happening in our current day. And that is following Mason's example, because she did that in her day. She was reading the heavy hitters in research in her day, and she was allowing that to inform her philosophy and her practice. And so we need to carry that torch forward. We've got to stay informed about what science is telling us about how children learn. And that's not so that if we find something that seems to rub up against Mason, it's not that it's not the same as trends. It's not that we're going to throw Mason out in favor of anything that's new, but whenever it does seem to rub up against Mason, that's when our work begins. We've got to do some sifting at that point, some interpretation. After we've done that research, part of our job is to disseminate it to you at conferences like this, through blogs. There's possibility we may be starting a podcast sometime when we in our free time. We'd like to do that, but finding ways to get that information out to you guys so that you can allow it to inform your practice. And then thinking about current trends in education and theories as they relate to Mason's work, and making a decision, do we need to pay attention to this? And if we do, how is it going to inform the practice? And how are we going to help people understand that we're not being dismissive of what Mason said? One of the things that we will not do, because we can't, I mean, it goes against the heart of a researcher. It goes against the conscience of a researcher to ignore evidence in favor of an idea that you want to believe. So that's why we do this wrestling work. So then we think about implications of what we're finding and application of what we're finding. We make recommendations. Again, at conferences like this, you'll see what we find making its way slowly, because this is a slow, deliberate process, but sometimes it will make its way slowly into products like the alveary. The alveary will begin to reflect some current research, and we're careful to have solid rationale whenever we do that. And then to help you guys, to help practitioners by providing whatever materials would be helpful for you. We also deal in outreach, forming relationships with people that are outside the Charlotte Mason community, like Dr. David Sobel. You know, he's not a Masonite, but his work is echoing the things that she was saying 100 years ago. It's carrying it forward. You know, he's in his research found some things that should start to influence our practice a little bit in terms of geography. And so, you know, we're not an insular, you know, exclusive group. We really want to be out in the community, not only to glean ideas, but to introduce other people to Mason's ideas, because now David Sobel is going to go forth and he'll know Charlotte Mason, and who knows what will come of that. We want to work on educating the public about Charlotte Mason, doing whatever small things we can to help influence policy, because our ultimate goal is for every child to be able to have this kind of education. And we can't do that if we stay insulated in a small homeschool community or a small private school community. So, you know, our work is just, it has a broader scope than that. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why the current research part is important, because some people will argue that it's not. Some people will argue that, well, Mason taught us everything we need to know, and so we don't need to even look at current research. Of course, you know, as researchers, this hurts my heart. So I want to tell you why. Why does it hurt my heart? And why is it important for you to keep up with what's happening? So here's a graphic that I came up with. Mason says that education is physiology plus psychology unified by philosophy. Take a minute to digest that. I know. Who said it reads like Chaucer? Karen said that, didn't she? We're not going to publish this. It reads like Chaucer. But I want you to think a minute about what is physiology and what is psychology and what is philosophy. Well, your philosophy comes out of what you believe to be true about human beings, and her philosophy came from definitely her Anglican Christian background. But physiology, that's science. So in her day, she was reading physiologists. She was reading psychologists. she wrote in her books about, well, this is how the brain works. This is how habit is formed. It changes the tissue in the brain, and this is what happens. Well, she's getting that from the research that she's reading at that time. 100 years on, we have a different understanding of how habits are formed. We have a different understanding of how brain tissue changes or neuroplasticity. We have a different understanding of that. So are we then, I mean, you have to make the decision. Are you going to stick with the science of 1923 when you die, or are you going to live in your current day and pay attention to the science of your current day? Same thing with philosophy. And Carol asks, would you visit a doctor? Would you go see a doctor who only studies medicine up through 1923 and doesn't pay attention to anything from the last 100 years? Go get the phlegm, please. Bring me a bowl of leeches. No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't do that. So that doesn't make sense. So the things that are science, we need to pay attention to. With that said, this right here is why I am still part of the Charlotte Mason movement, because Charlotte Mason, I feel, put together the most comprehensive and cohesive method of education, all the way from the philosophy to the boots on the ground. And most of the time you get one or the other. But she gave us all of it. She thought about the theology, who we are as image bearers. She thought about who we are as human beings, that anthropology. She thought about the purpose of education. She thought about what knowledge is, how learners learn, what's the relationship between learners and content. She thought about how you can tell when a child has learned something. And she took all of that and she made curriculum and developed methods that matched all of that. So you have a cohesive whole. This is very unusual. I've never seen another model of education that is this comprehensive and cohesive. And I feel like she got these things right. This is the philosophy here, that she was spot on with all of these things. But then you've got to think about the research. So I want to talk to you for just a minute about what good research is, because sometimes when I try to talk to people about we've got to read good research, I've heard it often, and it's always disheartening to me because sometimes people will say, well, yeah, but come on, you can make a study say anything you want it to say. You ever thought that? So the truth of the matter is you can make a study say whatever you want it to say. And we as a society have become pretty jaded because of the misuse of research to sell us something. So, you're scrolling through your Facebook feed or you're watching TV, and invariably you're going to see something that says, the latest study shows that if you eat this superfruit, you will lose weight. Or, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend trying, that kind of thing where you're being manipulated. We don't like being manipulated. And that's the way research is used in our everyday lives. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what good research is. Like if you are a researcher, these are the things that you do. When you set out to conduct a study, you don't start with the end in mind. So you can't say, I really believe that this is the way things happen. And so now as I do my reading, I'm going to only read the things that agree with the opinion that I already have. That's not research. That's proof texting. And it happens a lot. If you read a lot of articles, if you read a lot of blogs, if you listen to some podcasts, you can tell that the person already has this opinion and they're cherry picking either Parents Review articles or whatever they have at their disposal. They're cherry picking things that agree with an opinion that they have already accepted. So we don't do that. When you go into research, and it is really uncomfortable, you have to be willing to just follow the evidence wherever it goes and then deal with it. Because that's truth. If you're searching for truth, truth is going to lead you to, the search for truth is going to lead you to unexpected places sometimes. But you have to be willing to do that. You need to have some things that can be observed and measured, but you don't have to stop there. So sometimes researchers have this almost fetish-like, real science is observable and measurable, and if you can't observe it and measure it, then it doesn't exist. Well, we don't believe that. You've got to have the narrative, you've got to have the story part to help the quantitative part make sense. So the best research combines both of those things. It's not a single study. So like I said, you can make a single study say whatever you want it to say, but you can't make a body of research say whatever you want it to say. So here's what happens. Let's say somebody decides that they're curious about something, they want to explore something, they're asking questions. So an example of an exploratory study would be the dissertation that I did, which was, how in the Charlotte Mason model do kids learn how to write? How do they learn to compose if she doesn't have writing? They don't have composition. And so that was I did some interviews and collected, things in a lot of different directions, and then tried to find patterns, and I came up with a theory of what I think is happening, and that was my dissertation. Now, somebody may come behind me and say, well, I would like to test this part of this theory. And then somebody else might test a different part. Somebody else might test a different part. Somebody else might come back and retest the first part to see if they get the same result. So this goes on for years and years. And ultimately, you end up with a large body of research. Now, not so many people are researching how Mason educated children learn composition, but something like executive function, where Andy has been living in the last several years. There are a lot of people researching that and replicating studies and challenging findings, but you may have 50,000 studies that each study has a couple hundred kids in it that they're looking at. When you have that, then you can see really easily where the outliers are, and you can kick them to the curb, unless something happens later that makes you maybe want to take another look at that. But when you start looking at patterns, usually, when you get a body of research that big, somebody's going to come along and do a meta-analysis where they read it all and they're looking for patterns. What direction are all of these studies pointing in? If you've got 50,000 studies that each have a couple hundred kids, and they're pointing in one single direction except for a few outliers, what's happening is we're learning a little bit more about what we are as human beings. So you can trust that. You at least need to pay attention to it when it happens like that. So I want to talk a little about Mason's attitude towards science. First of all, she said that science is the ongoing revelation of God to man. So I want you to think about that meta-analysis where you've got these 50,000 studies, these, millions of kids that have been studied worldwide, and everything's pointing in the same direction. That was a lot of work for us, a lot of effort for us, but ultimately what's happened is now that's a way that God has revealed a little bit more to us. So if it's the ongoing revelation of science, number one, we can't stop in 1923 because God didn't stop revealing to us in 1923. It would be really sad if he did. And so if we consider science, good science, to be the ongoing revelation of God to man, then we don't have to be afraid of science. We don't have to be afraid that the science is going to overturn the Bible. You know, we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't have to, it might bump up against Mason, because Mason was an imperfect human being, and we choose not to deify her. So we're here 100 years later building on what she did and paying attention to the things that God is revealing to us about humanity and how children learn. So we don't have to be afraid of that. And she says that we have a responsibility towards science. The first thing we have to do is we have to know what the science says. That doesn't mean that we throw everything we thought we knew out. What it means is we've got to wrestle with it. We've got a big job to do. We've got to consider it. You've got to consider it in light of the philosophy. In this case, we're talking about Charlotte Mason stuff here. We've got to look at everything, you know, the overarching tone of her body of work. Is this in keeping with what she said? Is it in keeping with Scripture, which is our litmus of absolute truth? And then we have the responsibility to either reject that idea if it doesn't fit with what we know to be true about human beings. Then we don't have to do anything with new research. We're aware of it. We can leave it there. We can revisit it later if we feel the need to. But if we see that it is in keeping with what we know about who we are as human beings, it's in keeping with Scripture, then if we accept that idea, guess what comes next? You have to allow, if you accept that idea, you have to allow it to inform your practice. And that means that Charlotte Mason's methods may evolve a little bit. And that sounds heretical. We don't want to hear that, because it feels so good to feel like, oh, there's one person that got it right. If we just do exactly what she did, we're all going to be okay. That lets us off the hook. We're not off the hook. We've got to do our own thinking. We've got to do our own accepting and rejecting of ideas. And if you have good information, good science, it needs to inform your practice. But anything that we think we know, she says, you've got to hold it loosely. And this is why she had kids studying the history of science, because you never know. I mean, how many times in the history of mankind have we known something was true, and then somebody made a discovery that put the whole thing on its head? So if you have a responsibility to allow good science to inform what you do, but you have to be ready you've got to hold it with an open hand. Even what Mason did, I feel like we have to hold it with an open hand. We can't grip it tight out of fear because we're afraid we're going to mess things up. You got to hold it with an open hand, because ultimately it belongs to God. It's God's, and we don't have to be afraid to hold it with an open hand. So, since science is progressive, sometimes things can be disruptive. It can make you feel uncomfortable, but that's just when your work starts. So I just want to show in graphic form sort of where I think we are today as Mason followers. We have an enormous amount of respect and reverence for this woman. But I want to start first with the bigger picture, because God is bigger than Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason is not the only person in the world that God has ever revealed anything about education to. Laugh, but I'm just going to leave that there. So we're going to start. God He's over everything, and He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. science belongs to him. So we're putting that squarely in the center of God. Okay? So we don't have to be scared of science because it's God's. All right? Now, Mason was squarely inside both God and the science of her day. Right? Evidence of both of those things shows up in her writing. But she's not the yesterday and tomorrow, and she's not the ongoing. She was from 1842 to 1923. So since we reject the idea that God doesn't reveal anything new to anybody about how children learn, this is where we are. We're today. Somebody else is going to come after us and build on what we do. We're building on what Mason did. She's building on what science is telling her and what she knows to be true about God. But we have a job to do other than to try to replicate exactly what was happening in 1923. So that is what sets the Institute, I feel, apart from a personal blogger or personal podcaster. This is the kind of work that we do, that we are interested in doing. And I hope that that gives you confidence in what we're doing.